Father Williams has edited or authored over 22 books and many, many articles on ethics and business ethics, ethics and leadership in major journals, business journals. He is the director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Religious Values in Business in the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. He was a naval officer. His first degree was in chemical engineering. He earned his doctorate in ethics from Vanderbilt University and his bachelor's and master's from the University of Notre Dame. He's a Catholic priest in the Congregation of Holy Cross. At Notre Dame, he served as an Associate Provost of the university from 1987 to 1994. He is one of the founders of a division of the Academy Management called Social Issues in Management. This year, the Academy of Management recognized him for significant contribution in the field of management by awarding him the Sumner Marcus Award. It's a very prestigious academic award in arguably the strongest management academic association in the world, the Academy of Management. He's also served as a professor at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He has significant experience in South Africa. Worked with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu prior to Nelson Mandela being elected president there. He had worked with Truth and Reconciliation. He was a UN observer for the elections in South Africa. He also has worked in South Africa as a professor at a university in South Korea. The UN asked him to serve on a 3-person board of directors for the United Nations Global Compact Foundation that has 10,000 corporations from around the world in it, 160 countries represented in that organization. And it is that organization from the UN is to help build up corporate citizenship around the world. Believe me, I could go on and on about Father Williams. Perhaps one of the best things I can say, he's my friend. He's a guy you could depend on. He has ethics and morals that are admirable. And with that, I'd like to turn this podium over to my friend, Father Williams.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that introduction. My mother would be very proud. My father would be skeptical. I'm honored to be here. Jim Davis was a wonderful colleague at Notre Dame, certainly shared the values that I try to pursue in my teaching, and I'm happy to see that he landed on his feet in this great school. We'd still love to have him at Notre Dame, but you know, that's the way it goes. I told him, I am here. I had to turn down my good friend at Brigham Young, who asked me, he saw that I was coming to the Notre Dame Club and said, come spend the day with our students. I said, no, I've got to go to Utah State. And he said, why? So, and of course he said, well, stay another day. Well, I can't stay another day for the reason Jim outlined. I've got to get back to greet all my guests at Notre Dame are coming in for this football game. In any event, I'm going to talk about an hour. Is that, you know, academics could talk all day, so I always like to clear that up. But the overarching principle that I try to use in recent years in my research is help students understand the purpose of business. What is the purpose of business? Because you know, ask your friends at the next party, what's the purpose of business? And someone is bound to say, to make money. This is the purpose of business. And I think that has been the consensus for some time, and it's done a lot of harm. I don't think that is the purpose of business. I don't think business leaders for the most part, pursue that these days. And I think I've tried to help people understand that the purpose of business is to create sustainable value for stakeholders. And of course, one of your key stakeholders is the investor, and if you don't make money, you're not going to be here tomorrow. So don't let it be said that a clerk from Notre Dame told you you didn't have to make money in business. But it's much broader than that. You have to create sustainable value for employees, for suppliers, for the physical environment, and of course for your customers. It goes on. All the key stakeholders are the responsibility of the top management of any business. So the purpose of business is to create sustainable value for stakeholders. And I think that's done a lot of harm teaching young people that the purpose of business is simply to make money. Because some people thought they can do anything they can get away with. As long as they're making money, they're contributing to the good of society. And I often talk about other professions. If you ask a medical doctor, what's the purpose of being a medical doctor? They'll say to heal patients, and correctly. The doctor has to make money or he or she isn't here tomorrow. But that's not the purpose. What's the purpose of being a lawyer? To seek justice. That's at least what they teach in law school. But the lawyer has to make money or he or she isn't here tomorrow. What's the purpose of being a professor? To educate minds and hearts. But the professor has to make money or he or she isn't here tomorrow. And of course, as Professor Davis knows, we don't make enough. But I think we've done a lot of harm by teaching business students that the purpose of business is to make money. It's to create sustainable value for stakeholders. And that's a big challenge. And I think it's a challenge that's being taken up by most business leaders today, at least the ones that I work with in the UN Global Compact. I think my assistant makes these wonderful slides, so I've got to use some of them. She'll ask me when I get back, did you use them? But I think I'm not going to use them all. We'll be here, we missed lunch. But what I think you can see is that it's becoming more and more widely accepted by business leaders that their purpose is significantly more than returning well for investors. And this is a quote from the CEO of Novartis, which is a huge pharmaceutical company in the world. The first responsibility of a CEO is to run the company successfully and generate products which are useful to your customers, resulting in economic value creation. We also have to act responsibly, respecting not only the law, but also fulfilling legitimate expectations that society has of us. Today, these expectations, in most instances, go beyond short-term profit maximization. What people want is that business people behave in a responsible way in the communities in which they live, that they treat employees fairly, respect the environment, and demonstrate sensitivity to the problem of other disadvantaged people in the world. Now, in my terms, what the CEO of Novartis is saying is that the purpose of business is to create sustainable value for stakeholders. And he outlines some of what he thinks who the key stakeholders are, and that he has to keep an eye on. And so it's a great challenge to run a big organization. And I don't mind paying them very well because they have a lot of headaches in trying to balance the challenges and the stresses that come with trying to create sustainable value for your key stakeholders. One of the points that I stress is it's important in how you look at work. What is work? You know, and I tell the story of a man who looked at a construction project, and there were people laying bricks, building a building. And he asked the first man, "What are you doing in your work?" And the bricklayer said, "I just lay bricks all day, and I get paid pretty well. And then at the end of the day, I go home and have a couple drinks and play on the computer, and that keeps me going. For me, work is a job, and it's extrinsic motivation. I get money, in other words, and that's why I do it. And I get home and do what I really want to do, which is to have hobbies." And my friend asked the second man who was doing the same thing, he said, "What are you doing with your work? How do you look at this?" And the man said, "I have learned how to build wonderful walls, and they're aesthetically beautiful, and they're done according to the contours, and they're balanced well. And so I've learned a craft, and I do it very well, and I feel very good about what I've done at the end of the day because that wall is so attractive." And so that man saw what he was doing as a career. In other words, he had learned certain skills. He was doing a good job, and the motivation was somewhat intrinsic. He felt good at the end of the day because he built a good wall that had an attraction. And then my friend asked a third guy who was doing the same thing. He said, "What are you doing? How do you understand work?" And he said, "What I'm doing is building a wonderful concert hall, which will enable music to inspire people to look at the world and have a good life and see that there's a great purpose in culture and music." That third person had an overarching worldview. He saw what is his work as a vocation. In other words, he was making the world a little better place by laying these bricks. And the motivation was intrinsic. He was feeling a great reward because he was making the world a better place by laying these bricks. Well, each of us can look at work in one of three ways, or maybe a mixture of all three. If you look at your work as a job, you do whatever you have to do and then get home and have some fun. And so leisure time is amusement, just as my friend went home and had a couple drinks and played on the computer, if he just saw work as a job. Now, if you see work as a career, then at the end of the day, you go home and get rest. And particularly on weekends, you rest up so you can do really well on Monday when you get there. And so leisure is primarily rest time. If you see work as a vocation, then leisure is contemplation. Some time to reflect on what it is I'm all about. Why do I get up in the morning? And if you're religious, you have a religious overview. My overarching worldview is religious, but I work with a lot of people in the United Nations who say, "I wish I could be religious, but I'm not." But I have an overarching worldview that I advance human rights and the dignity of the person. And that's my intrinsic motivation. I feel really good when I can say I've advanced these human rights, I've enhanced the dignity of these workers. And so, look, let's face it, all of us have dimensions of our future which are simply going to be a job. You do certain things because you have to keep your job. And certainly all of you are going to have some dimension of life, work as a career. That's why you're here, to study, so you can get definable skills to make you attractive to some company or some place to work. And you can pursue what you're doing. But I'd like to think that all of us can move to the third level and have an overarching worldview, to see what we're doing in terms of some worldview which gets us up in the morning, which energizes us, and we feel we're contributing to making the world a better place, whether it be religious or a secular worldview. As I say, I work with a lot of people. Many of my friends say, "I wish I could have the faith that you do, but I don't." But I have a great feeling for the dignity of people, for advancing human rights, for giving them some chance to eke out some sort of a decent, fulfilling human life. And that's my overarching worldview. And therefore, I have a vocation. And so I think that's crucial. And I think the CEO of Novartis is really saying he has a vocation. And I think business is a wonderful vocation. Those of you who enter the business world are going to create wealth, you're going to create jobs, and hopefully products that make a world a better place. All of us stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. And you and I are going to live much longer lives than our great-grandfathers because of pharmaceutical products, because of good music, which gives us time for leisure and contemplation. And I have time to do hiking. As I look out at this beautiful scenery, I'm inspired. You know, if you come from Indiana, you don't see anything but flat land. But you probably are too used to it, but it's inspiring to me. And can be contemplative. In other words, it reminds me that life is more than simply getting another article published or getting promoted. Life is an opportunity to advance the great gifts that are all around us. Again, you're free to get these slides. There are more here than we'd never get to lunch if I show them all. But I think one that I might read to you, which I think is a lot of sense, says, "We welcome the current debate on the role of business in society. However, much of this debate revolves around a misleading distinction between pursuing shareholder value and demonstrating corporate social responsibility, or called CSR. However, as the director of McKinsey & Company has observed, both views obscure the real relationship of business to so-called external issues, and it's time the debate was recast. The purpose of any business that seeks to be sustainable has to be more than generating short-term shareholder value. Simply by adding the word long-term to shareholder value, we embrace everything necessary for the survival and success of the company. That includes building trust among communities and maintaining a healthy environment in which to do business." In other words, what he's saying here, and McKinsey & Company, as you know, is a very reputable consulting group, is that if you create sustainable value for all the key stakeholders, you're going to have a long-term success, maybe a little short-term cost. I remember some 20 years ago when I was first going to South Africa, I was with the CEO of Coca-Cola Africa. And they had these huge trucks, they call them lorries, they take in their products in the most rural villages, way out. More rural than you and I could ever get to in our Land Rover or whatever, because the roads are so terrible, and when it rains they're all muddy, and the big trucks could get in. And he said, we also take in the cab of the trucks healthcare workers, and we take medicines. And I said, well, as an ethicist, I'm inspired. That's really great. How do you explain that to your shareholders? Because it's costing them money. You're putting them up and you're... Oh, he said, it's simple. Sick people won't buy Coca-Cola. Well, you see, that's at the root of sustainability. What he saw, without the tools of conceptual tools that Jim Davis and I developed for them, is that the long-term health of this company, once they decided to go into developing countries and rural areas, depended on having a stable and healthy society. And the government couldn't afford to do it. In half the world they can't, and certainly in Africa. There wasn't much health care provided by the government or public service. And so they decided as long as they're going into these rural areas, they had to help stabilize it. For their long-term health, they had to take a little short-term cost. And that's what they've done, and it's worked for the most part. They are in the most rural areas, and they supply whatever it takes to stabilize the society. In some cases, they send some of the leaders to be educated on management skills. In some cases, they provide medicines for the poor and those who don't have what it takes. And so I think that's important to understand that it's in business's long-term interest to try to take care of developing countries' stability and long-term and health. And so in the UN Global Compact, as Jim mentioned, we have 10,000 companies, and a lot of them are doing just that. And I'm going to give you a quick profile of 10 or 15 of projects that the companies are doing that are real. I just spent 2 weeks in the United Nations in New York and get updated. We brought 1,000 CEOs in to talk about what they're doing, and so they could help those other companies that are still struggling to find projects. This is a very important graph here. As Jim said, my first degree is in chem engineering. Until I see a graph or something, it's not clear. But the World Economic Forum, which is the top 1,000 companies in the world, meets in Davos, Switzerland every year, and they pay to survey what consumers around the world are thinking. And why would they do that? They pay millions of dollars for surveys like this, and this is just one page. They give this one out for free. If you want the whole thing, it costs $5,000, which I'm not about to pay. But they pay these surveys. It says there they interviewed 25,000 average citizens in 23 countries on 6 continents. Imagine what that costs. They go into a country and they hire the best polling group and tell them what they want, and then they put all this data together. Well, companies are interested in what consumers are thinking because they've realized if they don't meet legitimate consumer expectations, they're going to be overregulated. And I think the Sarbanes-Oxley law, which some of you are probably familiar with in accountancy, is a good example. Companies should have not cooked the books. And they did, and then the people were upset, and they forced Congress to pass a very tough law, which probably overdoes it in my mind, but it's what happens when people don't listen to legitimate consumer expectations. And so what you see there is a survey which asks, what is the role of large companies in society? And you could answer one of 3 ways. You could say their role is to make a profit, pay taxes, create jobs, and obey all laws. And that's pretty much the position of Milton Friedman, those of you who studied economics. That's the classical understanding of the role of business in society. Or you could say the role is, to the right, set higher ethical standards and help build a better society. Or you could say something in the middle. So you had one of 3 choices. And what you see there is the number of countries. In fact, in Australia, for example, 88% want something different than the classical role of business in society. In Australia, pretty much similar in Canada, USA, Great Britain. And then you go down the line, and down in Kazakhstan, they still want, at least many of them, 48%, want the classical role of business in society. And I think the variable which helps explain this, and you could do a doctoral dissertation on this, so I don't claim to answer it all, but in my opinion and judgment, the variable which helps explain why is Kazakhstan still want the classical role, and that is because they're all hungry. They don't have jobs, they don't have food on the table, and they're not worried about the physical environment. They're not worried about the quality of the water or the air, or because they're still struggling to get some sort of a decent life and out of dire poverty. But what it does show that is, in the developed world, most people expect business, the consumer expectations are much higher than they used to be. It's a remarkable change in 20, 25 years. And people expect big business to take on some of the challenges of the developing countries. Not because business caused these problems, they didn't. But business has the management skills to help solve them. And people are very skeptical that government has the management skills today to help solve them. And it's a whole other lecture I could give about governments today, but I'm not going to. And I was just at the UN for 2 weeks, and people from around the world kept asking me, what do you think of your president? And I said, I'm not going to get into that discussion today. So this is what I already talked about. The purpose of business is to create sustainable value for stakeholders. And all people in any profession need to make money, but that isn't their purpose. In Catholic social teaching, it's been around 100 years. They've been saying the purpose of business is much wider than making money. And this is from one of the encyclicals, which is a doctrine of the church. And now it's pretty well accepted in the secular literature. The best management literature pretty well accepts what we were saying 100 years ago. So it's, and this talks about that there. This is just an understanding of CSR, corporate social responsibility. 20 years ago it was considered to be philanthropy. In other words, a company that had a good social conscience would give money to Utah State University or give money to Notre Dame. And that would be their corporate social responsibility. Now it's much more. It's value creation. Corporate social responsibility is creating value for employees, creating value for suppliers, creating value for the physical environment, taking care of your customers, of course. And so CSR, the people in the development office at Notre Dame keep saying, stop saying that. We need more money. But it's not enough to say I gave to the Boy Scouts and therefore I've done my corporate social responsibility. Your corporate social responsibility is to create value for all the major stakeholders insofar as you can. And there are, of course, limits in what a company can do. And then a good definition of sustainability, which I put up there, it means that each enterprise must balance the need for long-term viability or prosperity. And think of the Coca-Cola example in Africa that I gave you, of the enterprise itself and the society and environment upon which it relies for its ability to generate economic value with the requirements for short-term competitiveness and financial gain. So in other words, my friend in Coca-Cola 25 years ago had this insight. He didn't have all the vocabulary. The word sustainability wasn't even being used. But he saw that the long-term health of his company depended on the stability of the countries where he was going. And therefore, if he wanted to market in those poor developing countries, they had to do something to help stabilize some of the society. And that's basically what's behind the notion of sustainability. And the best companies saw it very early, and most companies, certainly the 10,000 companies in the UN Global Compact, see it very clearly today. And they're all, insofar as they want to work in developing countries, trying to look at their long-term future and trying to stabilize and build up the societies where they're marketing their products. Again, these are available. Anybody wants to get them, I'm sure Professor Davis can pass on these slides and you can think about things that I didn't mention, but I think I'm trying to do the highlights. So the UN Global Compact, I hitched my star and tried to advance them because I think that's the best organization that's trying to advance ethical values today in the wider world. The founder of the UN Global Compact was Kofi Annan, who was then Secretary General in the year 2000. And what he was, if you remember the year 2000, some of the faculty certainly will, some of the students were just a gleam in their father's eye. But in the year 2000, sweatshops were a big problem. And Nike was being heavily criticized because they were manufacturing their athletic gear all over the world in very poor developing countries. And they weren't paying a living wage. People would work 10, 12 hours a day. They couldn't go to the bathroom for 10 hours. Sexual harassment was a problem. The safety standards in the manufacturing plants were a problem. And it was heavily criticized. There was a lot of bad press coming for Nike. Nike was the poster child for bad behavior in developing countries. But for every Nike that you knew about, there were 1,000 under the radar. And because everybody was kind of going into poor developing countries and manufacturing at very low cost. What Kofi Annan said, look, if you want globalization to continue, companies are going to have to take measures and voluntarily respect human rights that they're forced to respect in Salt Lake City or Paris or London or New York. In other words, by law, if you run a sweatshop in this town, you're going to be in jail or you're going to be heavily fined. But in developing countries, you can do anything you want. You just pay off a couple people. And those of you who worked outside of this country know, unfortunately, that's the case. And Kofi Annan said, if we want to keep the respectability of business, we're going to have to voluntarily have big companies try to enforce human rights, try to live up to the same kind of standards they would in the United States or Europe. And so the companies, the big companies who already had come around to this idea said, this is a great idea, let's house this in the United Nations. And Kofi Annan said, well, the problem is most people in the United Nations think that business is the problem, not the solution. And it will be very hard to get it passed. And well, after some thought and reflection, Kofi Annan said, well, we're going to get it in the United Nations. He went before the General Assembly and he said, if the United Nations is to be relevant in the 21st century, we've got to get business involved in making the world a better place, because that's where the power is. It's not in nation states anymore. Well, you could hear a pin drop and people didn't like it, but they knew it was true. Those of you who studied big corporations know that the budget of some of our biggest corporations is greater than 85% of the nation states of the world. And where there's money, there's power. Don't let them kid you. My friends don't like me to keep saying this, but it's true. And business has responded. So the United Nations formed the UN Global Compact in the year 2000. We started with about 20 companies. Today we have 10,000 companies in 160 countries. And they're committed to try to advance human rights, particularly in developing countries. Well, I should look at this one. This is Kofi Annan himself. He said, let us choose to unite the power of markets with the authority of universal ideals. Let us choose to reconcile the creative forces of private entrepreneurship with the needs of the disadvantaged and the requirements of future generations. And so what he was referring to was the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations lays out 30 human rights that they think everybody should be afforded in order to eke out some sort of a human life. And Kofi Annan said at least the basic human rights ought to be part of the mission of any business going into developing countries. First of all, they ought to make sure they're not the reason people don't have their human rights. That's the primary, do no harm, basic ethical principle. Second of all, if they have the resources, they should try to advance the human rights insofar as they can. And that's basically what we did. We formed 10 principles from UN documents concerning human rights, or all concerning human rights, but the physical environment, labor, and anti-corruption. And so there are 10 principles covering those 4 areas. When a company joins the Global Compact, they're basically saying, we are going to advance human rights in developing countries, particularly in the area of labor, the physical environment, anti-corruption, and basic human rights. And we have 10,000 companies who are committed to that. They're obliged to write a report every year showing how well they're doing. Now, when a company joins the Global Compact, it doesn't mean they've arrived and are completely 100% advancing all these rights. For example, if you're in China, and an awful lot of our companies are, you really can't advance, you can't push labor unions too strong, at least the unions of the workers' choice. And there's certain other repressive issues. But companies who go to China should try to respect the dignity of their workers and give them some opportunities for speaking up about their needs and their concerns. And I always tell people who are skeptical, look, joining a global compact means you have aspirations. You have aspirations to make the world a better place through trying to advance these human rights. And doesn't mean you've realized all your aspirations. It's somewhat like you can go to a church or a mosque or a temple. If I had to have realized all the ideals of my faith, I'd never be allowed in church. I'm working. It's a work in progress. And maybe some of you have realized all your ideals. And if you are, I bless you. But most of us are still struggling, trying to realize our ideals. But we do go and participate in some sort of worship. And that's basically what I tell the companies. You don't have to realize them all right now, but you have to aspire to trying to realize them and show us in your annual report. And so the 10,000 companies each have an annual report, which is on their website. You can look up unglobalcompact.org and your favorite company. Most of the big companies in Utah are, in fact, members. And you can see what they're doing and how they're doing it and where they think they still have some work to do. People say, well, why wouldn't people just lie and say they're all doing great things? And the great sanction is the press. The press looks at these things. And if you say you're doing something and they find you're not, they got a great story. And everyone's after, that's the meat for reporters, getting a great story. So business is very timid to say something that isn't true. In fact, in the Global Compact, we hardly ever have it happen. Because the press will expose it. And, frankly, most companies want to tell you the truth anyway. But not all, unfortunately. I mentioned earlier, the one case which disappointed me, I was shocked, was VW. VW was one of our better companies in the UN Global Compact, doing tremendous projects for helping the poor around the world and helping lower their carbon footprint. But VW marketed their products, their cars, by saying that we are polluting less than everybody else. And what they were doing was installing computers which showed they were polluting less, but they were rigged, and they were polluting more. And they finally got caught by some scientists in a university, in fact. Said, how are they doing this? And so they took one of their cars apart and did all kinds of experiments and said they're not doing it. They're saying they're doing it, but they rigged the computers. Well, that's an outrageous case of ethical failure, it seems to me. And we had to ask them to leave the Global Compact. And we said, if you change your top management, all of whom were involved, as best we could tell, then we'll think about letting you in later on. But it's just an example. Sometimes people say I'm too Pollyannish, I'm so positive on companies, but I want to tell you, there are cases where you have to be negative because they've done terrible things. And they've harmed a lot of people. People with respiratory problems have a lot of diesel engines around them, have serious problems. And it's a serious ethical issue. So what we did was, when we, in the year 2000, is looked at the UN documents and said, what principles can we extract from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ILO Declaration. ILO is International Labor Organization, which is a UN bureau, and the Rio Declaration, which is UN meetings in Rio de Janeiro on the environment, and the UN Convention Against Corruption. And we distilled from that 10 principles, and those are the 4 areas under human rights: labor, environment, anti-corruption. And those, as I mentioned, are the principles that companies agree to follow if they join the Global Compact. And I think we're quite successful. Sometimes these are spoken of in terms of ESG issues. Some of your professors may use that term. ESG means environmental, social, ethical, and governance issues. And they are basically the core issues of the UN Global Compact. And we've got a lot of big investment companies focusing on only investing in companies that are following the ESG principles. We might just look at this. This is a couple years ago, there were only 8,000 companies, if you can read that to let. Now there are 10,000 in the UN Global Compact. But there are 58 million workers in Global Compact companies. Today it's more like 65 million. So we continue to grow. And you can see the number of reports submitted. It's increased by multiple thousands by now. But, and you can see those dots are where the major areas company participation are. And in some countries, every mom and pop company belongs, like Spain. Spain has over 1,000 companies. In the United States, I think it's 200 or 300 companies, but only big companies are encouraged to join. And we let it go either way. It depends on the political motivations. But we're interested in companies joining, big, small, medium. About 50% of the 10,000 companies are small or medium size. Now, most of the big projects are done by large companies, and I'll read off some of those in a moment. But now, 3 or 4 years after we started the Global Compact, the CEOs came to us on the board and said, you know, we're hiring the best and the brightest in business schools, but they don't know anything about environmental issues or labor issues or climate change issues, human rights. And you ought to put that into business school education. And so we formed a committee which was chaired by the then dean of the business school of Notre Dame, Carolyn Wu. I had something to do with that. And they put together a commission of college presidents and deans of business schools and came up with the principles for responsible management education. And basically, a business school joins if they're willing to bring these issues into the education of business students. And so we have almost 1,000 business schools have joined this around the world who are trying to teach. And I know it's the kind of thing that Professor Davis teaches very well, the principles for responsible management education. And so what are some of the projects? I just wrote an article. My most recent article is on how to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. As Jim mentioned, I teach in Korea for 5 or 6 weeks every year. And how can we get the North and South together? And the article, after 5 reviews, was finally accepted. The Chinese were holding it up, but they finally let it through. It's in the Asian Journal of Business Ethics. One of the points the reviewers made was, Williams is so positive on all the companies. Why doesn't he talk about some of the failures? And so I put some of the failures in. I put Enron, Parmalat, VW, Escom, and Wells Fargo. All of those have had big scandals. But then what I wanted to do was to show that a lot of the big companies are doing marvelous things. And I can just talk about, just very briefly, and then I'll conclude. Unilever, for example, has an initiative in India teaching business schools to over 75,000 women in low-income families. Kellogg, Breakfast for Better Days, donates 2.5 billion servings of food to poor people, as well as educating them on nutritional issues. AstraZeneca Youth Health Program focuses on prevention of non-communicable diseases in 20 countries, reaching 2.25 million youth. BASF's educational initiatives in Africa has donated over 2 million desks and set up kids' labs and virtual chemistry laboratories. L'Oreal, I don't use their products, but my sisters love it, works to promote gender equality in the workplace and has over 70% women in the company, including many in senior positions. Suez France provides clean water and sanitation and services to 1 million in 5 continents. Microsoft has invested in renewable energy, has data centers and carbon neutral, and sources 100% of its electric requirements from renewable energy sources. And that was even a surprise to me. Microsoft, a huge organization. Bill Gates is one of our big exponents in the Global Compact, and they're completely no carbon footprint for Microsoft. And that's spent a lot of money, but they feel it's the right thing. Nestle Needs Youth works to equip 10 million people, young people with skills to improve employability. BMW has induced electric vehicles and installed electric charging stations. MasterCard has a program called City Possible, works to form public-private partnerships to advance inclusive and sustainable communities. Renault is a leader in recycling automotive components, thus minimizing the ecological footprint and improving the quality of air, water, and land. And it goes on and on. But I just want to give you an idea. These companies are doing projects that are reaching millions of people that you probably haven't heard about. So when you read about the next scandal in the Wall Street Journal of Business, and you probably get a good one every week, remember there are a lot of companies who are trying to make the world a better place, not only by their products and services, but by their advancement of the Sustainable Development Goals. All right, thank you. Time for questions.
Okay. We have time for 3 or 4 questions. I think we have a microphone over here. So, do we have questions? Quiet audience.
companies?
Yes. I remember one case, Howard Schultz, who's the founder of Starbucks, spoke at my school, and he said when he first started, he said he was going to make sure the people picking coffee beans were not children, make sure they were getting a fair wage, make sure the farmers were getting a fair price for the coffee bean. And some of his shareholders, this is 25, 30 years ago, said, "Howard, you're taking our money." And Howard said, "Sell my stock, because that's what I'm going to do." And now, if you had sold the stock then, you would have lost 1,000% increase. He's made a lot of millionaires. So yes, some of the shareholders do complain, and the best companies say, take it or leave it.
Please say your name as well, what you're studying.
Logan Ross and aviation maintenance. Do you think what these companies are doing is enough?
That's a good question. Well, you know, you can never do enough. I can't and you can't. But I think companies have to look at their own resources. Their first responsibility is to give their employees a good salary and take care of their investors. But I think many are doing enough. Some are not doing anything.
My name's Grace. I'm just wondering what you think is the best way to inspire continued progress in not only the what consumers expect from their businesses, but also the businesses expecting long-term sustainability from themselves.
Yeah, and that's a very good question. It's something I think about. We have about 20% of the big companies have joined the UN Global Compact. We figure if we have 30% of the ones in the world, we reach what we call the tipping point. You're probably familiar with that, where it becomes commonly accepted that this is the way to be. And how do we inspire more and more companies to be that way? And I think one of the quick answers is select CEOs who are men and women of character. I work with Paul Pullman closely. Paul was the CEO of Unilever. He just retired, and a real deep sense of not only making good products for the people, but making the world a better place. He's a man who has a conscience, who really realizes with all this power, I have to do something with it besides simply make money for myself, which I might add he's done very well at. And I think the more we have men and women of character running our organizations, the better off we're going to be. And that's tough to get boards to think about that, but more and more of them are thinking about that. And I think that's a hopeful sign. As you can tell, I'm an optimist. Is the glass half full or half empty? I always think it's half full.